Pentiment is a mystery game, and that mystery is present through the multi-layered branching narrative which may or may not satisfy some players. But there's a far more upfront yet subtle mystery in Pentiment that's ingeniously presented through the world. Who is playing the game? Now obviously you're the one playing the game, but there's a much deeper meaning to Pentiment that's shown in how the game is presented to the player. My evidence that there's indeed a mystery to be solved here is quite simple. The game of Pentiment is played from the perspective of someone observing a book. This is most apparent in Pentiment's UI. For example, when the map or journal needs to be consulted, the camera zooms out and other books that the player needs to reference are placed on top of the story. The reason for this is because, like the player, this mystery man will also need the same information to understand the story that they are reading or writing. Further evidence is the box art for the game. This is the first time I'm doing a section on the box art, and that's because it directly ties into the world of Pentiment. The figure's head is masked in an orange haze, slumped over the desk that the book lays on when we go into the menus. This figure never shows up in the game because he's actually the player character, the one who's dictating the direction of the story, a god if you will. But I believe that the game Pentiment gives us all the clues we need to solve whether this person has discovered the story or is writing it, and what their name is. Starting with the format of Pentiment, that of an illustrated book from ages past. The art style seen in the tome is almost pristine. The thick, scratchy lines that form the silhouette of the characters stands in stark contrast to the soft colours used to bring said characters to life. There's a softness to the colours of Pentiment, which to me seems like a way of recreating how these colours would naturally fade over time, from the bright splotches of ink that were initially printed. This leads me to believe that whoever is reading the story of Pentiment is doing so much later. But is Pentiment being read or written? Well, the art style points to the former, as the drawings look as though they've had time to fade. It's the fonts of Pentiment that make me question if this story is in the past or present tense. Before we get into the mystery of the font, I first want to gush about the font itself. I'm a font nerd myself, as for every thumbnail I make, I have to research the best free font that matches the logo of whatever game I'm discussing. Pentiment lacks dialogue, which is an excellent decision, as voice acting would have massively adverse effects on the pacing of the game, but this doesn't mean you can't hear the characters. The reason different characters have different fonts is to represent the dialect of each resident of Tassing. Peasants speak in chicken scratch, which indicates a poor vocabulary and a hastily spoken tone, whilst brothers and sisters of the Abbey speak in a more refined and fanciful tongue. This indicates better pronunciation and a more deliberate pace to their words. The printer Klaus's words are directly printed onto the page because of his vocation. While this is an outlier to my theory, I believe it's a symbolic gesture that will become apparent once you've finished the video. That alone is fantastic, and provides extra characterization to what would otherwise be a dull avalanche of scripture that disengages the majority of the audience. But there's a much cleverer way that Pentiment engages its audience through text, and it's the next part of the mystery as to who the reader might be. From a mechanical standpoint, the inconsistencies in the dialogue spelling are supposed to grab the player's attention to ensure their eyes don't glaze over from the deluge of reading Pentiment presents. But what's the artistic reason for it being here? I believe it's the nail in the coffin that buries the lead of Pentiment being read. The tale is clearly being written by the author, but my interpretation of the colour palette isn't incorrect. It's time for me to summarise my findings and solve the meta-mystery of Pentiment. Still, before I do, I should give a spoiler warning, as the game never does reveal who this mystery person is. Still, I believe I know, but now is the time for spoilers, so please click away if you haven't finished Pentiment. Even though I know the third act is a drag, I encourage you to complete the game and return to this analysis. The answer is a boring one, but it's clearly Andreas who has taken it upon himself to write his autobiography during and after his seclusion in the Abbey. The colours of Pentiment are faded because the story was being inked over the course of the 18-year time jump from Act 2 to Act 3. This is why, unlike the text, we never see the world itself being drawn. This also explains the spelling errors, as Andreas himself mentions that the only things keeping him sane during his isolation were the books he managed to save during the fire. But of course, his being so malnourished and weak would lead to him making several errors while recounting his tale, despite his prestigious education. He has access to the journals because he kept them and will reference them because it's not the player who's forgotten their next objective, it's Andreas himself. I believe that Andreas sequestered himself in the Rathus in his twilight years to finally add the dialogue to his story that he used his old friend Klaus's store to print, and when he completed the final page of his story, he closed his eyes and drifted off to sleep.